Welcome to another Directions Mag podcast, co-hosted with our friends at URISA. Today we have Dr. Matt Gerike with the URISA Education Committee chatting with Chris Dunn of GeoVelo about geospatial experts as witnesses.
GIS professionals may be subject matter experts in many subject fields that are modeled in GIS, but may also be subject matter experts in geospatial technology. One of the niches of professional practice in providing public service is to serve as an expert witness in a court of law or a legal proceeding. With us today is Chris Dunn to talk about his experiences as a GIS professional and expert witness. Chris, please introduce yourself and tell us about how you became interested in serving as a geospatial expert witness.
Okay, Matt, this story goes all the way back to the early 1980s when I made my first shot at college and didn't really do that well. My GPA was pretty much a straight slope towards zero after 4 years, and so I realized I needed to do something different. I went into the Army, and I saw a lot of the world, got to travel, and ended up serving during Desert Storm as an explosive ordnance disposal tech, and that was a fantastic job. I got to go all kinds of places, and it fueled the geographer in me that I didn't know was there. And then after the Army, I went to Kansas State to finish my bachelor's degree, and I was a much more serious student than I was before the Army. And I took a general ed requirement course. It was a geography course, and I just smoked it. I absolutely loved that course. I started talking with the professors, and they said, "Hey, would you like to come over and see the department?" And then I went over and I saw the GIS lab, and I was just hooked. It was this is 30 years ago, and I don't know if your listeners will even know what a 486 machine was with Windows 3.1 running ArcInfo 6. I mean, it was all command line. It was green screen. The plotters actually came over, grabbed ink pens, and then moved across a sheet of static paper. That's how you got something out of a graphic. And so they were the early days of GIS, obviously not, all the way back at the Roger Tomlinson early days, but it was a really exciting time. And then I kind of discovered that you could actually make a living in the field, and so it wasn't just a vanity degree. And I got a bachelor's, got the master's, and was very happy and started off on my career. Eventually, after about 20 years of working in the public sector, the city, county, tribal, and federal level, I just wanted to do something more entrepreneurial. And so in 2010, I made the decision to go to law school because I thought it would be a good combination. And I thought that I could somehow work in that, Venn diagram overlap between geography and the law. And when I got to law school, nobody was writing articles about this. There wasn't much case law on it, but it was a really exciting time. And finished my law degree at the University of Missouri in 2014 and passed the bar that summer. And I thought I would work in planning and zoning law for a while, but during law school, I had the opportunity to work on an innocence project case where there was a kid who got sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole at 14 for a murder he absolutely did not commit. And I was asked to make some exhibits for that case, and that's kind of where this all started. And so made the exhibits, testified in court for basically the second time in my life, and had a state's attorney general try to rough me up, but the testimony survived, and they say it was essential to reversing the finding in his case. And so I was kind of hooked. It was using geography for truth and justice. I mean, you can't get more energized than that. So that's how I got here.
What does a normal project look like? Can you walk us through an example from where you were brought on board to the resolution of a case?
Sure. My clients, for the most part, are other attorneys. Sometimes they're civil attorneys, sometimes they're criminal defense attorneys, sometimes they're like the legal staff of a state or federal agency. I've also worked for a state public defender's office, and I've done a bunch of pro bono work. And I also worked for the Missouri Humanities Council, mapping some various activities they're involved in. So there is no real typical project, but I can tell you that 90% of the stuff I do will never end up in court. It's more investigatory. It's, running something down for the client, putting together a geospatial picture that they can look at and then make decisions in their case on how they want to proceed. So sometimes it's property boundary disputes, sometimes it's it's murders, sometimes it's accident scenes, sometimes it's investigatory stuff to find where historic events occurred. And so there's no one real typical case. And a lot of times I'm getting challenges to do things I haven't done with the technology before. And a lot of times, I'll have to say, hey, I've not done this particular thing. And they go, well, nobody else is really working in this field, so could you give it a try? And so I like that because it's always stretching my geospatial skills. When ArcPro came up, that was a stretch for me because I hadn't really had a GIS course in years, and sometimes I'm using SketchUp to do a 3D model that I insert into a GIS, or sometimes I'm using LiDAR, and it's just every case is a little bit different, and they're all exciting. So,
excellent. That sounds interesting because sometimes GIS professionals find themselves doing the same things over and over again, and it sounds like how you're able to help is really pull a tool or a technique or a software or an application out of the box where it really fits the particular problem, the particular challenge that
right.
that walks in the door.
And a lot of times I find I'm synthesizing and incorporating the work of others, where I'll analyze how an engineering firm created their GIS, or I'll incorporate the work of a surveyor, or I'll incorporate, engineering plans. And, sometimes you're using old drawings from the 80s that you've got to geo-rectify and then, turn into some kind of vector with some assurances of accuracy. Other times, those CAD formats, that they're just so hard to sometimes bring over into GIS and make work. So the early days of my GIS experience was trying to figure out how to get something from one format to another, and here it is 30 years later, and I'm still beating my head against non-compatible formats and importing things. It's a never-ending story there.
So what do the deliverables wind up looking like if you're working on a case or working with the client? Are you still making maps, or what tends to be the most common things that kind of are used in these types of situations and scenarios?
Sometimes I'll shoot a client over a KMZ or a KML file. Sometimes, I used to have an office in Jefferson City, and I had a big conference room, but nobody wanted to come. What I find is my clients like it when I can show up in their office with a fast laptop and a second monitor, and then I can take them through the graphics I've prepared about their particular case. And sometimes I'm just, we'll have a shared drive, and I'll drop a bunch of PDFs in there. Or there's other times where, I've got a large format plotter in the basement, and, I'll make foam core exhibits. Typically 20 by 30 is the sweet spot, not too big for the courtroom, not too small that they go unnoticed. And one of the major things attorneys like is to get the exhibits that they show the jury or the judge in court into the jury room. And if you take that image that was up on a PDF and you also present it on a piece of foam core on an easel in front of the jury, that can go back into the room with the jury. And so they can see these things, they can look at them in detail. And so the other thing I try to do that's not really a deliverable is I try to coach my attorney clients on how people relate to geospatial images. And, we all know that not everybody is geospatially, I call it geospatial blindness. And, so when you're selecting the jury, and if the case hinges on where something was, and you're bringing evidence to support that, you've got to be able to ensure that your jury is actually capable of seeing what you're presenting. And so I'll coach them on how to, ask jurors questions in a way that reveals whether, they can find their car in a parking lot or they can read a map. And so, I'm just the geography coach on a team. And so that's kind of my deliverable.
So it's interesting to me that you kind of frame yourself as a geography coach, because spatial thinking is a skill and a tool that some folks use and practice a lot, and some don't. But I wonder what happens if we flip it on its head a little bit, because when we work on regular geospatial projects, that there are some things that we probably always do or always probably should do, and kind of best practices. I wonder, are there any things you do different if you're working with geospatial technology and it's an expert witness case, or it's something that
yes.
may affect a court proceeding? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that would shock your listeners is I don't produce a lot of metadata for the layers I develop, because those layers are never released into the wild, and they're always the work product that's the attorney-client work product, and the only thing that gets out into the public domain are, the end examples, the PDFs or the JPEGs that I produce. I don't produce that standardized metadata. I do for a couple of clients, but what I do differently is, because of discovery, and if you remember my cousin Vinny, you ask the other attorney for everything you're producing, and once an attorney decides they're going to use me in court, we're obligated to provide a fair and accurate copy of my work product. And so what I'll do is I'll make a report that lists every single layer, the scale, the projection, and the source, and, possibly even the symbology. In addition to, I provide the other side with the MXD, and I'll, make up a GDB with all of the, the data inside. And so they can take it, they can tear it apart, and they can make a judgment on, whether this is, a good quality map that can't be beat up in court. And so why bother attacking it? Or, if they find a flaw, which they haven't so far, it makes that encounter in court fair for both sides. So everything is well documented. It's just not documented in a way where you'd hang it on a publicly accessible website.
Sometimes a GIS technician or a manager, especially if they work in local government or regional government, may be subpoenaed to testify. Beyond being scary, what legal nuances does this raise for GIS professionals?
Okay, this is the most important question I think you probably asked me, and it's the one I really hope to address when I talked with you about doing this podcast. Every city, county, tribal, federal organization that the majority of this audience works for has an attorney. And what GIS techs need to understand is that attorney is not their attorney. 99 times out of 100, your interests will be aligned. And frankly, most technical professional testimony is not very controversial, and it's just there to establish, a case that'll be built further with other information. But there are times occasionally where your own attorney may need to throw you under the bus in order to resolve the case to its organizational satisfaction. And while that is rare, it does occur. And I know this not from personal experience, but what I've got is I've got one of those Google searches where I am constantly looking at geospatial case law, where if any of these 20 terms I've got out there in the search engine come across, I'll get the case where one of our fellow techs has testified, and you can see sometimes that if the tech has made a mistake, sometimes there's a little sacrifice on the altar for him. So that's something to be aware of. It's really uncommon, but it does occur. Let's see, what else? Always tell the truth. If you're on the stand, don't shade things to make your side look better. Just tell the truth, but be candid, or not candid, be concise. Your side probably doesn't want you to elaborate. They just want you to answer the questions as quickly as you can. Now, if your organization is planning on going to court and they've got good attorneys, they will probably take you through a thing where we call it witness prep, where you sit down with the witness. You may even take them over to the courthouse and show them the room and say, okay, this is what we're going to ask you to testify on. These are the kind of questions we're going to ask you. Would you like to run through your answers? And a good attorney won't shape or mold your answers. They will just let you answer, but they may say, hey, okay, that was a little long-winded, or hey, that was a little too technical. The first couple times I was testifying, all of the attorneys told me, dumb it down, take it down, use simpler words, not so much tech geek speak. And so that's witness prep, and that's an entirely legitimate activity on your witness's side. And sometimes they'll also prep you for a deposition. And now, deposition is sometimes it's a more confrontational style of interview that's taken under oath. And most technical witnesses don't receive a really hard grilling unless the crux of the case is in the technicalities. For instance, a lot of times a GIS person will be asked to provide a map that shows the 2,000 foot from the school zone, drug-free zone. And, so they're brought up on stand. How did you produce this map? What did you produce it from? And a lot of times the other side will stipulate and just say, yeah, that's an accurate map. And then you move on. But that tech had to be in court to provide foundation for that bit of evidence. And so in depositions and court testimony, you're very unlikely to have a really confrontational TV style, cross-examination by the other side. But you don't have to answer instantly. And if it does kind of take that turn, think about it. Answer slowly, answer accurately, and then concisely. Now, the most bizarre thing I've ever seen in a courtroom was where I was presenting exhibits, and this was a case that involved the state's attorney general's office. And the guy who was cross-examining me was kind of putting on this show of purposely not understanding what I was presenting. And he did that to cast doubt on the quality of the exhibits I had produced. He wasn't very effective. It was like, I brought in a couple of graphics, and he would point off in space, not actually on the graphics, and ask me what was occurring here. And then I'd talk about, well, if this was, an actual 3D model, and that location would be something. And it was sort of like, I don't know how to describe it. It was just incredulous. One of those big words that says, I don't understand what you're saying, and no one else could either. And so that was a little weird, but it has happened in the past. If you're going into court and you've prepared an exhibit and say the sheriff's using something you produced or the prosecuting attorney's using something you produced, you need to know what the layers were, what the projection was, what the units were. You need to know how that was built. And if one of your subordinates built it, they should probably be testifying. Or, if you know something's going to court and you've got the technical skills, you should do it. Or otherwise have the person that created the evidence go in your stead. So let's see, what else can I tell you about? If you're ever asked to bend the truth or to lie on the stand, the first thing you do is make a non-committal answer and you go find yourself your own attorney, because things are getting a little dicey. So that's about it, Matt. What do you think?
So that's great. There are lots of good tips, both general for professionals, but also some interesting things to consider if you get into the area of producing evidence or serving as an expert witness. What recommendations or advice would you give to GIS professionals that might be interested in getting into this area and working to produce exhibits for evidence or working as an expert witness using geospatial technology?
You've got a golden opportunity to work in an area where you can be radically committed to the truth. You can get up every day and know your work is good, and that no matter what the situation is, you're going to produce the most truthful and accurate exhibit possible and let the chips fall where they may. And the thing is I've worked with a lot of really ethical attorneys. I've never had a single attorney ask me to tip the scale or, have something move the needle. And that has been an amazing experience. I didn't always expect that, but occasionally you will lose a job, a potential job, if you make it very clear up front to your client that you're going to produce the exhibit and the things will be the way they are, as close as you can determine, and that may not always be in their favor. Now, I've had an attorney that's hired me for several cases, and several times I've run the GIS, I've done the investigation, I've gone out with my GNSS stick, and I've had to come back to them and say, hey, this doesn't work for you. And they're accepting of that, because at least they know they can't take that case forward and expect to win. So they go back to their client and say, hey, our initial investigation said this. To confirm that, you can hire a surveyor to go out and, really nail this down in a much more precise manner. I'm using a mapping grade GNSS device specifically so I don't tread on the surveyor's territory. And a lot of the times what I'm asked to do is do that initial investigation, do some geo-rectification of some aerial photos, download some stuff from the state data center, put it all together, and then they'll decide whether, it stands up and they want to invest the money that, it might cost to survey, several sections of ground. I think people are better off if they've got a lot of skills and, kind of the human Swiss Army knife approach to things. You're not going to know how to do everything on every single case. Now, you've got an ethical obligation to your clients to tell them, hey, I've never done this. Several years ago, I'd never incorporated LiDAR into a project, and I had to say, I don't know how to do this. And they said, that's fine. We can't find anybody else that does what you do, so we'll pay you to learn. And that's fantastic. The other thing is just recognize that a lot of humanity is spatially blind, and advise your clients. You don't want to discriminate against potential jury members for things that, are protected characteristics, that sort of thing. But it is perfectly valid if a case is spatial to suggest that people who can't find their own home on a county map in a rural jury, aren't on the jury. So I think that's a fair way of doing voir dire. Understand that being an entrepreneurial is feast and famine, and that it might take a few years to get established. And unfortunately, you need some credentials behind your name. I know there are people out there that work GIS that don't have much, fancy lettering behind their name, but they're really good. But when an attorney is going to use you in a court of law, they need to be able to, present you as an expert. And in Missouri, the judge decides whether you cut the mustard and whether you've had enough education and experience to be legitimately presented in a court of law as an expert. So the other thing is show up on time, do what you say you're going to do, and clean up your mess before you leave. That's the best business plan there is.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Chris, for sharing your thoughts on geospatial professionals serving as expert witnesses. And thank you for tuning in to this edition of the URISA Directions Magazine podcast series.